Okay. Well, welcome to our final wellness lecture of the year. I'm glad to see all of you here. I think you're going to have a very interesting evening tonight. Going along our theme of lifestyle and longevity, we have the pleasure of having cardiologist Brian Taschner, who is a cardiologist in Fort Myers. He graduated from the University of Florida College of Medicine in Gainesville and completed his internal medicine residency at the Medical College of Virginia, serving as the chief resident. And he went on to complete his fellowship at St. Louis University Hospital in St. Louis and served as a Chief Cardiology Fellow. He's very obviously interested in diet and lifestyle. And because of that, he's opened a center in Fort Myers called the Vibrant Beat Lifestyle Center. He opened that last August, I believe.
Yep.
And it's a eating, and he believes eating a healthy diet, stopping smoking, making sure your sleep habits are good, working on mindfulness to minimize stress, and having a good social support system are the things that healthy populations practice. I think we do a pretty good job of that here at the sanctuary, but we can do better. So I think you're going to be very interested in what he has to say, and I give you Dr. Brian Taschner.
Thank you. I actually have, I think I'm mic'd up. Can everybody hear me with the wireless mic? This is on, right? It is on. Okay. Okay, perfect. I can't tell from here. So yeah, the setup here is a little different tonight. So I'm going to be I don't have a computer in front of me, so I'm going to be glancing back a little bit, but I'll try to make sure I pay attention to you guys as well. It's always nice to come out here. I did a talk, what was it, a couple months ago on just lifestyle and chronic disease. So this is my second talk out here. This one's going to focus more on nutrition. And it's always peaceful coming over the bridge from a busy day at work. So I know it's so crazy to get out here during the season. So it's actually really nice though whenever the traffic's going the other way, getting the sun glistening off the water. So what I try to do with this talk, I'm a big advocate for lifestyle in general. When we talk about the diet part, I really focus on a plant-based diet or maybe a variation of a Mediterranean type diet. But when I talk to my patients about that, a lot of people are they have no idea where to start. It's so foreign to many people. So what I wanted to do here was talk about, what a plant-based diet is and give some different models, some things that may resonate, resonate differently with different people. There's a number of different models out there. And talk about some nutritional controversies, supplements, things that I always get asked. So just to educate you on things that are common questions for me. And feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to stop and answer questions. I'll try to keep the talk at about an hour. So some of the slides I may just kind of move through quickly just in the interest of time, but I'm happy to stay and answer questions after. And if you can't hear me at some point, just yell or throw something at me. So, and as I mentioned, I've been practicing cardiology for almost 20 years here in town. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I really got into this aspect of lifestyle, but I was finding I couldn't promote it enough in the office. And that's why I ended up opening this center, this Vibrant Beat Center, so we could spend more time with people that want to come in and learn how to cook and work on their fitness more and just learn some more specifics about plant-based eating. So what this is a general outline of what we're going to talk about of initially foods that are overconsumed. That's only one slide. Foods that are underconsumed, which is basically the basis of the whole talk here. How can we incorporate more of these disease-fighting foods into our everyday diet? And then we'll talk about some nutritional controversies. So things that people always ask about: are eggs good? Are eggs bad? What about olive oil? Is cholesterol good or bad? Is dietary cholesterol good or bad? So I'm going to touch on all these different things here. So overconsumed foods, like I said, is really one slide. Unfortunately, in Western society, in our country, about 2/3 of what we eat is processed foods. There's a large portion, about 1/4 of what we eat is animal-based protein. And you can see only 12% of what we eat is plant-based foods. And half of that is processed plant food. So things like tomato sauce or apples and apple pie or applesauce. So really only about 5% of what we eat is whole plant-based foods. And what I try to promote or advocate for is really making that the majority of your diet, 70 to 80% of your diet. The problem with a lot of these processed foods, they're very calorie dense, but nutritionally deplete. And most of these processed foods are high in saturated and trans fats, refined grains, refined sugars, and high in sodium. So the talk that I did here before focused a lot on nutrition and chronic disease, a lot of the diseases we see every day: blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, cholesterol, coronary artery disease. And we see that there's a very strong association between these overconsumed foods and all these chronic diseases. Just because I mentioned sodium here, I'm going to be talking about underconsumed vitamins and minerals, I just figured I'd throw the sodium in here. So when I talk to a lot of patients about sodium, they say, well, I never use the salt shaker. I don't put salt on food. But many of you probably know that most of the salt that we eat, or most of the sodium, comes in foods that are already prepared. So it's not necessarily what we're putting on with the salt shaker, but things that are mixed dishes that they call them. So burgers and tacos and pastas, dressings, sauces. So if you look on the menu of any restaurant, you're going to see that most of these things or most of the dishes you're served are very high in sodium. If you're eating whole plant-based foods, unless you're adding sodium, you're really not going to get much. Hidden sources, I thought it was really interesting. I did an article on this a couple years ago, and I was even surprised to find that just chicken that you buy in the store, before you even season it, oftentimes is injected with broth. So just for a few ounces of chicken, you get 400 to 500 milligrams of sodium. Shrimp, so if you've had shrimp that's been frozen, oftentimes it's frozen with a preservative that adds a lot of sodium. So about 800 milligrams just for 3 ounces. It's not very much shrimp. And again, that's before you add salt or cocktail sauce or whatever else that you're dipping it in. Bread, so breads can have, 150 to 200 milligrams per slice or more. And then condiments are another big one. So you add on, ketchup and mustard. So it's basically a lot of hidden sources. If you're eating foods that are prepackaged, it's really important to read the labels. I saw a really, I think I have it on here, just a good rule of thumb. If you're trying to follow like a 2,000 calorie diet, for instance, you're eating packaged foods, make sure that the sodium is not more than the calories. So if you're aiming to eat less than 2,000 milligrams of sodium a day, you want to make sure that you look at the calories and there's not more sodium than there are calories. And that will kind of keep your sodium number under if you're eating packaged foods. Again, if you're eating whole unprocessed foods, really not an issue. This was, I wanted to throw this slide up. I had this in my other talk too, which basically, if you look at the top line over here, this is kind of the standard American diet. So this is a regular diet, a lot of processed foods, high in sodium, about 3,500 milligrams. And what this is from a study called the DASH diet, or the DASH study, where they showed that just switching from a standard diet, even a high sodium diet, to a plant-based diet can reduce the blood pressure by 8 or 10 points. And a lot of that has to do with processed foods having effects that help actually constrict the blood vessels, whereas plant-based foods help to keep the vessels dilated. If we go in the standard diet and we still eat a lot of junk food, but we lower sodium, that also can lower the blood pressure, 8 points or so. And if we do both things, we switch to plant-based diet and eat less sodium, we can lower the blood pressure somewhere between 12 and 15 points. So shortfall nutrients, when we talk about plant-based diet, a lot of people, in our country, in Western society, we automatically equate nutrition with protein. I mean, it says protein is the focal point of our meals here. So when patients start to talk to me, that's the first question they ask. They say, where am I going to get my protein from? They don't ever ask where I'm going to get, my magnesium from, or where am I going to get my fiber from? And the fact of the matter is protein, 97%, the statistics are 97% of people get plenty of protein, but only 3% get enough fiber. So when we look at shortfall nutrients, they tend to be all these vitamins and minerals. So your calcium, magnesium, potassium are big ones. I actually just had a lady today ask me if she should take a potassium or magnesium supplement. And really, if you're eating a wide variety of plant-based foods, really shouldn't need to. Fat-soluble vitamins, so A, D, E, and K, vitamin C, the B vitamins, iron. These are all things that we tend to underconsume. And if you look at the bottom here, there was a study looking at 13,000 people across the country, and they found that people that followed a plant-based diet, they were able to absorb and intake much more of these vitamins than people following a standard American diet. Fiber is another big one. I have a separate slide on that, but really on average, Americans only eat about 18 grams per day. They only consume about 18 grams. The recommendations are about, you can see 25 for women and 38 for men. I don't even know why there's that much of a discrepancy, but really for true health benefits, trying to get about 50 plus grams of fiber is ideal. So what should we be eating? So there's, I have a number of different slides here that we're going to go through. And this is what I try to do with my patients in the office. So I show these different experts and their method of promoting plant-based diet, which are really the same concepts, but again, certain presentations resonate more with certain people. I like this from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. They make it very simple. On the top there is a quote by this Michael Pollan, who's a food journalist. He says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. He has a book called In Defense of Food, which is very interesting. So that means eat food, eat real food, watch your portion size. So be mindful. A lot of us just, we're socializing, we're watching TV when we're eating. We're not really paying attention to what we're eating. So if we focus on chewing and tasting the food, we tend to not consume as much volume, and then try to make it mostly plants. It's also important to consider the food package. So the point of this talk isn't for everyone to go home and say, well, where do I get, what did he say about calcium or magnesium or iron? It's really to understand that most of these underconsumed nutrients are found in many plant-based foods. And as long as you're eating a variety of these, you're going to get enough nutrients. So, but we want to consider the food package. So a good example is if we're trying to say, we want to get enough calcium, you can get that from dairy, but you can also get it from leafy green vegetables. And we know that dairy has some association with saturated fat, higher association with prostate cancer, whereas leafy greens give you a lot of antioxidants, fiber that we tend to miss, as well as a lot of these other underconsumed nutrients. We want to focus on whole foods, as I mentioned. So degrees of processing matter too. So if you take apples and you cook them and you make an applesauce at home, that's processed, but it's minimally processed. If you turn it into an apple pie or a bar, like a nutrition bar that has apples in it, that's more processed. So the less processed it is, the better, the more that the food looks like the whole food. And then really focusing on vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts and seeds. That's kind of the basis of a plant-based diet. And then making sure we eat the rainbow. So we'll see, I'm going to talk about antioxidants, this antioxidant index later. And we can see that all the different colors represent different phytochemicals and antioxidants. So it's important to try to get foods from the different color spectrums. This is just a nice, you don't have to read all this. I'm not going to read it all here, but this is a sheet I hand out to a lot of my patients, and it also summarizes and simplifies a lot of what I just mentioned. So they mention eat plenty of these things, which are those things that I just mentioned with the fruits, veggies, beans, whole grains, nuts, and seeds, and limit all of the things that we talked about before, the processed foods, which contain a lot of the saturated and trans fats and refined grains and sugars. And I like this too, because there's nice examples of all those things on the bottom. Dr. Greger, he has some great books out there. One's called How Not to Die, one's called How Not to Diet. He's a really funny speaker, a funny author, but he has what he calls his daily dozen. And for anyone that's interested, you can actually download this on your phone. So he basically promotes these same sort of things, focusing on grains, beans, leafy greens, fruits, vegetables, but he has a number of servings with each of these every day. So on this app, if you decide to download it, you can kind of check off how many servings of each thing you've eaten every day. And he himself says the point isn't that you have to get stressed about eating all these things. It's kind of making these a goal. And as you're eating more of these foods, you're going to eat less of the foods that we don't want you to eat, less of the processed foods. And he also has this simplified regimen of red, yellow, and green. So like the traffic light. So green light foods are all the whole unprocessed foods. Yellow light foods are things that are not terrible, not as nutritious as a green light food. So you might say like a piece of whole wheat bread is a yellow light food where it's not as healthy as a head of broccoli or kale. But if you use the bread and you use a wrap and you fill it with beans and veggies, you're using it as a vehicle to get more nutrients in you. And red light foods are the things that we really try to avoid. So foods with saturated fat, refined sugars, oils. So every time you eat something, you can kind of put something into one of those general categories. Dr. Joel Fuhrman also has some great books out there. One that I like is called Eat to Live. He developed something called the ANDI index, the aggregate nutrient density index, basically looking at how many nutrients are in each calorie. So that's another way to conceptualize it, is say, well, if I'm trying to make everything that I eat, or most things that I eat, be as nutrient dense as possible. And these scores were based, the highest score is 1,000, based on 28 micronutrients, phytochemicals, as well as an antioxidant score. And this is a list of those things. So, and this is something that you can find online. But if you start up here, these like the leafy greens tend to be the highest. Then your cruciferous vegetables. So when I talk to patients, I tell them, those are the things that you're really aiming to include every day. Your broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and all your leafy greens, your arugula, your kale, your romaine. And then you start to see some of the other water-based veggies, fruits, tofu, beans, whole grains. And as you get down here, more of the animal proteins and processed foods. I also like his acronym GBOMS, which is greens, beans, onions, mushrooms, berries, and seeds. So these are things that are felt to be very nutrient dense, high in fiber, immune boosting. Nice acronym to remember. I always thought that onions and garlic and mushrooms were just like, well, I thought mushrooms were mostly water, but they actually are incredibly nutritious. And things like onions and garlic in this allium family, even though they add a lot of flavor, they have very powerful antioxidants called organosulfur, so cancer fighting. So they're not just for flavor. I encourage people to eat them. They're kind of like a free veggie because they don't really fill you up too much, but they add a lot of flavor with tons of nutrition. This one I share with almost all of my patients in the office. So what I like about this pyramid is, when I talk to people, I say, well, what do you eat? Tell me what you eat on a particular day. First, people say, well, I don't eat meat. I don't eat red meat, or I only eat red meat once a month. And I don't eat fried things. But they don't really tell me that they eat a lot of veggies. So usually they'll say, well, I have, chicken and I have a vegetable. But where I really would like them to come in, after I educate them, a few months later, maybe come and say, I'm eating this. This is what my dinner is. I'm eating, half my plate is veggies. I have some beans and grains. I'm eating a few fruits during the day. And if they're going to eat some animal protein, use it as a condiment. So it's all the way up here on the pyramid. And that's really what the basis of like Mediterranean or Blue Zones diet is. It doesn't mean that you have to become vegan or that they're following a vegan diet. It's in making the base of your diet more of these natural whole foods. So obviously I'm very biased because I really am into plant-based eating, and I know that there's huge benefits when it comes to a lot of the chronic diseases. But I wanted to point out a few non-biased sources that also support a plant-based way of eating. So the Lancet, which is a really prestigious medical journal, put together a group, I think it was a couple years ago now. It's called the Eat Lancet study. And so these were people, 19 commissioners, 18 co-authors, 16 different countries around the world. They were basically trying to come up with a diet that was inexpensive. So a diet that would be nutritious, affordable for everywhere around the world, a lot of the third world countries, and preserve our earth, preserve the environment. And together they came up with something that looks a lot of like what I'm telling my patients to eat. So about half the plate is veggies and fruits, and then you have all the other things that we're talking about: grains, beans, very little dairy here, very little animal protein, very little added sugars, but everything else is plant-based food. So that's felt to be the most sustainable diet, the most affordable diet, and the most nutritious diet. And again, this was not a plant-based team. This was a wide variety of people in different professions that came up with this. And if you look at, this was a U.S. News World Report publication from just last year, from 2020. And they list a bunch of different diets. But if you look at heart healthy diet, best diet overall, best diet for diabetes, best diet for healthy living, they all include some variation of plant-based diet. So a lot of them are the Ornish diet. He's a completely plant-based, one of the godfathers in the plant-based movement, if you will. Mediterranean and DASH diet, which we just talked about with the low sodium. They talk about a flexitarian diet, which is mostly plant-based, including a little bit of animal protein. So again, another unbiased source that really supports this way of eating to help heart disease, diabetes, healthy living overall. So I was going to touch on the next few slides on some of those underconsumed nutrients, just to show you that there are sources in the plant-based world of getting things like calcium. I didn't include protein on here because protein is really not an underconsumed nutrient, but that's probably, again, the most common question that I get. But just to comment on that, it's very easy to get protein on a plant-based diet. And most of us have this notion that we have to consume, 150 or 200 grams of protein a day. Really, for the average man, it's about 60 to 80 grams is plenty. and for the average woman, a little bit less, maybe 50 to 60 grams. So like a cup of lentils or a cup of black beans has almost 20 grams of protein and 20 grams of fiber. Tofu, tempeh, nuts and seeds, breads, oatmeal, all of this stuff has protein in it. So it's actually very easy to get to that number on a plant-based diet. So we don't always have to equate animal protein with our source of protein, although we have a tendency to do that. As far as calcium goes, we know that we can get calcium from dairy. Interestingly, countries that consume more dairy tend to have more fractures. And one of the thoughts is that, that dairy is acidic and it actually leaches other minerals from your bones. So US we're one of the countries that consumes the most dairy, and we have one of the highest rates of fractures, contrary to what you think would be the case. But most of the nut milks, so almond milk, oat milk, coconut milk, any of those you can buy, they have so many varieties in the store now. Those are usually fortified with calcium. Here it says 300 milligrams of calcium per cup. I just looked at the oat milk I have. I think it was about like 450 milligrams. Calcium's in a lot of the leafy green vegetables, broccoli, it's in tofu, soy nuts, edamame beans. Again, I don't want everyone to go home and say, okay, I've got to put all these things together so I get my 1,000 milligrams a day. But if you're eating a variety of these foods, just know that you're probably getting enough. They also have a lot of plant-based yogurts as well. The only caveat with the leafy greens is some of them, spinach, beet greens. Does anyone eat beet greens? I like them, but a lot of times people, if you get beets with the greens, they just throw them away. They're actually kind of spicy. They're good to saute. But spinach, Swiss chard, another kind of spicy green, and beet greens, they're very high in oxalate, and that can prevent the absorption of calcium. So you shouldn't rely just on those greens to get your calcium, but almost every other green, there's great absorption of calcium, more so than you absorb from dairy. B12 is an interesting one. So if you're vegan, you're probably not getting any B12 because it usually comes from animal sources. But believe it or not, a lot of people that are not vegan or vegetarian are still deficient in B12. And part of that is the B12 is in our soil. It's made from bacteria in the soil. Animals get their B12 from consuming, dirty, whatever they're eating, hay or grass. But even that has become a little bit depleted in bacteria and B12. It's become we're using antibiotics, and it's become more hygienic. So a lot of the cattle and chickens, they're supplemented with B12 now. For people who are more of a plant-based diet, there are some things that are supplemented with B12 as well, like nutritional yeast. But in general, when we talk about supplements, I encourage most people to take a B12 supplement because it's such a common deficiency. This can, a lot of people say, well, I feel more energetic when I take B12. Some of that I think is a placebo effect. But if you really are B12 deficient, you can become anemic, and anemia can certainly cause fatigue. Also the B12 has a lot to do with nerve conduction. So some of the symptoms people might get are like a neuropathy, so numbness and tingling of their extremities, sometimes some cognitive issues. I thought we were going to be stuck on that slide forever. So yeah, so here are some of the other things. Some grains, plant milks, nutritional yeast, these are all supplemented. And actually with the supplemented foods uses a different form of B12. It's not a protein-bound form. And that actually tends to be better absorbed than what we see in meats. The other thing which I didn't mention is, people that have had things like gastric bypass, that have inflammatory bowel disease, or people taking proton pump inhibitors where it really reduces the acid in the stomach, this can also lead to lack of absorption. So even if they're consuming enough, they may not be absorbing it well. So the plant-based form, the supplemented form, doesn't require people to have as much acid in their stomach. But there's the proton pump inhibitors, the acid reducers, are one of the most common medications we use. And then, is everyone familiar with vitamin K? That's another one. I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, a patient was teaching me about it. I had to go read more about it. But vitamin K2, has anyone heard of vitamin K2? Yeah, so there's like K1, which we as cardiologists think about this a lot because for people that are on Coumadin, vitamin K counteracts the effects of Coumadin. But there's also a K2, which is actually it's a completely different vitamin. It's a kind of vitamin K, but completely different than K1. It's really not found in many plant-based foods. If you look here, it's in natto, which is a fermented soy product mostly consumed in Japan. I've actually never been able to find it here, although someone really recently showed me some place you can order online out of New York, and some sauerkraut, but you're probably not going to be getting enough K2 just from plant-based foods. The most common sources are, you can see here, chicken liver, cheese, egg yolks, butter, things that I usually recommend people don't eat. The benefit of K2, and they've actually done some studies on this, it helps to regulate calcium. So it keeps calcium out of the blood vessels and into the bones. So this is one of the things that we do recommend supplementing, or I often talk to my patients about. Many times it actually comes in combination with vitamin D. So vitamin D and K2 are important for calcium regulation. So about 150 milligrams a day, you can find that in a supplement. And there's two forms in particular, MK4, MK7. Those are the ones that are most clinically relevant. And then vitamin D. So this is one other one that many people are deficient in. And the reason, well, you guys might not, you're out, sounds like you're a pretty active community, playing tennis, playing golf, out swimming and walking. So, but for many people aren't out in the sun very much, or we're covered up, we put sunscreen on. So we're not really fully exposed. And most of the vitamin D in our systems is formed from the sun hitting the skin and a reaction that takes place. There are some foods that have some vitamin D naturally. You can see that there's fortified milks, fortified oatmeal, some mushrooms. But in general, and then if you're, again, eating plant-based, but including some seafood, because there's some bones in there, sardines, salmon, tuna has some of this as well as some calcium. But, you know, if you're not eating foods that are enough fortified foods, you're not out in the sun very much, we usually will recommend taking a supplement. So I just thought this was a cool reaction to share. But basically, there's a precursor in our skin, and when that reacts with the UV light from the sun, that forms this pre-vitamin D3. And then we have to rely on conversion in the liver and the kidneys really to make the active form. So also people with kidney disease and liver disease may not have enough of this active form. So because it's such a complex process, and we're not out in the sun and not necessarily eating enough of a wide variety of healthy foods, most people are deficient. All right, antioxidants. So this was, so I think of antioxidants as, if you, as a simple way to describe it is, because we use that term a lot, it's always thrown around, but if you think of just water and iron, for instance, so over time, the iron becomes oxidized, it gets rusted, and that's kind of what's happening in our body if we have too many oxidants, pro-oxidants. And pro-oxidants come from things like stress, environmental exposures like pollutants, food, lack of sleep. So anything that throws our body off and can put a stress on our body. Antioxidants basically fight that process. So if you put a piece of iron in water and you threw substance X in there that's an antioxidant, it would prevent it from rusting. And that's what these things do inside our bodies. They prevent our bodies from rusting, essentially. There is something called the ORAC index, which was more popularized for a while. As you see here, it's no longer supported by the USDA. And part of the reason for that, these experiments were all done in test tubes. So they put something like iron and something like water together and then threw these different foods in there, and they saw which ones prevented the rusting the most. And they created this index, but they said, well, we're not sure how biologically applicable this is. So we know that these foods, again, looking at the variety of colors, a variety of different classes of vegetables and fruits, have a lot of antioxidants. And I wouldn't focus on one superfood. That's what we tend to do here. I'm going to take resveratrol because it's an antioxidant, or I'm going to eat goji berries because I know that they're high in antioxidants. I love goji berries, by the way. But we shouldn't just focus on one of these things. We should try to eat antioxidants from many different classes. These are some of the oxidative stresses. So a lot of the processed foods that we eat, very high in pro-oxidants, environmental toxins. We really can't get away totally from pesticides now. If you're in a city where there's not a good air quality. Basically and these are all the processes in our bodies that pro-oxidants can contribute to. So they can damage the DNA as our cells replicate, that can lead to cancer, cause chronic inflammation, which is really the root cause of a lot of the chronic diseases we see, coronary disease, autoimmune disease, cause premature aging with so cellular death, cognitive dysfunction. I thought this was kind of a cool picture too. So these are all the different stressors that we're talking about here. And what oxidation is they steal, this is an atom, like an oxygen atom, and all these things, these stressors knock some of the electrons out. And when they don't have the number of electrons they should floating around, that becomes a pro-oxidant or a free radical. You probably have heard that term before. What the antioxidant foods do is they actually donate one of their electrons to these free radicals, so they make them back to their base state. They make them normal again. It's kind of an easy picture to help conceptualize it. This is that one of the, there's many different charts you can look up online of this ORAC index, but this was one that I thought had some color in it, so I kind of liked it. But goji berries were actually at the top here. But really, you're looking for anything that's vibrant in color. So the more colorful it is, the more antioxidant it tends to have. Again, rather than thinking of specific foods, I like to think of food groups like your cruciferous vegetables, as we saw, were very high on that Dr. Furman's index. Those are very high in sulforaphane. Berries have, especially the dark berries or anything that's black colored. So purple potatoes, blackberries, black rice, blueberries have anthocyanins. The allium vegetables, the garlic, onions, they're very high in the organosulfurs. So if you think of these different classes, trying to get a variety from those, or if you just, think of just the different colors, you know, your green, red, orange, yellow, purple, try to eat something from each one of those classes every day, and you're going to get a good variety of all the different antioxidants. Any questions so far? I'm going to save them all for the end. Perfect. So now fats. So one of the things I wanted to mention here, because I'm going to talk a little bit about fats and carbohydrates. So often, you know, when I talk to people, I mean, they tell me, first of all, that they don't eat meat, or they only eat meat once a week. They almost universally now, when I ask them what they're doing to lose weight, they say, I'm not eating carbohydrates. That's probably the worst thing you can do for anything. I mean, for whether it's for weight, whether it's for diabetes, whether it's for heart disease, because if we're already a fiber deficient society, and then you knock out carbohydrates, you're going to get zero fiber. And a lot of people equate carbohydrates with being fat, with diabetes, but it's actually just the opposite. It's important to define what kind of carbohydrates you're excluding. And the same goes with fats. So if we're trying to knock out fats, should we knock out all fats? That's a source of debate as well. But most studies will show that, you know, there's eating healthier fats is actually good for you as long as it's done in moderation. And knocking out saturated fats, trans fats, is really what we want to try to exclude. So I don't think people should necessarily think of a keto or low carb diet or low fat diet. It should be a diet that includes moderate amount of carbohydrates and maybe a small to moderate amount of healthy fats, but excluding bad carbohydrates, excluding bad fats. I put this picture, I'm someone that's very visual, so I put this picture up here so we can learn about the difference between saturated and unsaturated fats. So a fat is basically just a line of carbon atoms with all these hydrogen atoms attached to it. So when it's saturated, it just means all these carbons are full of hydrogen. They're saturated. You can't put any more on there. And what happens is that thing gets so stiff you can't move it. It doesn't bend. So what happens with a saturated fat at room temperature, it's just a solid, right? So if you have coconut oil or butter, if you have it, leave it out at room temperature, it's going to stay solid, and that's why. Unsaturated fats are things like olive oil, avocado oil, walnut oil, any of those sorts of things. They have a couple of carbons that are not saturated with hydrogen, so it can bend. That's why they're liquid at room temperature. That's what I think happens in your arteries. You don't want something like this floating around your arteries. You want something to go around the curves a little more. Pump through your heart. When we talk about omega-3s and omega-6s, everyone I think pretty much knows omega-3s. They say, well, I need to make sure I get my omega-3s, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. These are unsaturated fats, so they have carbons that are not saturated with hydrogen. In the 3 and the 6 are just defined by where those carbons are unsaturated. So this is like 6 spaces from the end. This is 3 spaces from the end. We're going to talk a little bit about health implications of omega-3s and omega-6s. There are a bunch of different kinds of saturated fat as well. So the ones that are most in meats, cheeses, dairy that are most harmful are like the palmitic acid, myristic acid. There's been a lot of debate about coconut. So coconut is higher in something called lauric acid. The people who promote the consumption of coconut oil and coconut in general talk about this being more of a medium chain triglyceride. So rather than long chain triglycerides, it has medium chain triglycerides. So it's metabolized a little bit differently in the liver. It's used as energy, kind of like carbohydrates. I still don't promote it as a health food, even though it's metabolized a little bit differently. There's really not data out there to suggest it's a health food. If you're on a ketogenic diet, which a lot of people are, this is a fat that a lot of them consume for that reason, because it's supposed to be, give them a little bit more energy and burned off rather than stored. The problem with saturated fat, and I could get in there. There was a big article in Time that all these guys refer to, a few years ago, or it was butter was on the cover, and they said butter is back, and they talked about some studies which showed that, well, maybe saturated fat's not so bad, but there were a lot of issues with some of the studies that were done that showed that. So that would probably be a whole nother talk. So I'm not going to get into that as much. But what we know in general is that the saturated fat consumption correlates directly with your bad cholesterol, your LDL level. So it's actually, it's such a linear correlation that there's a formula where you can predict how much your bad cholesterol is going to go up by the amount of saturated fat that you eat. And we know that the higher your bad cholesterol, the greater the incidence of heart disease and heart events. So as the cholesterol goes up, incidence of heart disease goes up. So more saturated fat you eat tends to lead to more cardiovascular events. As I was mentioning before, I know this is a very hard slide to see, so I'll explain it to you, but I was mentioning good fats, good carbs, bad carbs. So this was a publication, this presidential statement from the American Heart Association. Basically what they said up here was, we're going to take saturated fats and exchange it for something else and see what happens. So if you exchange saturated fats for trans fats, which are even worse, and they're banned from all of our foods now, people tend to do worse. Anything on this side is worse. But if we exchange saturated fats for healthier fats, polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fats, people have less cardiovascular events. If you exchange saturated fats for bad carbohydrates, people do worse. But if you exchange it for good carbohydrates, they do better. And that's why it's so important to define not just fat or carbohydrate, but good carbohydrates, good fats, bad fats. And then they did the same thing here. If you took refined carbohydrates and you switched it for bad fats, you do worse. If you took the refined carbohydrate calories and you switch it for good fats or good carbohydrates, you do better. So again, it's not all about the carbs or the fats, it's which kind of carbs, which kind of fats. Top sources of saturated fat in our country. A lot of people are surprised to see chicken as the number 5 source. So that's a big thing when I talk to people. They say, well, I eat a really healthy diet. I eat chicken all day. I eat chicken sausage in the morning and a chicken deli sandwich and chicken at night. And it's great because it's chicken and it's not red meat. But chicken also has, aggregately, because we eat so much chicken, it actually contributes more saturated fat to our diets than red meat does. So the cheese is obviously the number 1. Cheese and pizza account for most of the saturated fat. Then desserts, so things like muffins, cookies, danishes, dairy desserts, so like ice cream is in there. And then chicken's the next one. So it's important to keep that in mind that, if we're eating enough of it, even if it has less saturated fat than red meat, we're eating so much of it that it still plays a role. Yeah. Yeah, so nuts and seeds, even though they have monounsaturated fats, which are healthy, they do have some percentage of them saturated fat. I actually have a slide later where I'll show you a lot of the oils, like the avocado oil, the walnut oil, olive oil. They do have some saturated fats in them. So if people are eating more of these, and that could be in things like peanut butter, almond butter, nuts, when you look at the amount of that altogether, that may end up being, which is surprising that would be more than the potatoes or potato chips, but you can see they're pretty close here. But I guess people do eat a lot of peanut butter. But again, it's, if you make in your diet, you're eating peanut butter instead of French fries, you're going to be getting, with that little bit of saturated fat, you're getting mostly monounsaturated fats, which have some health benefits. So again, this is the aggregate contribution to our diet. And if you look at pasta too, I think that's funny that's on there, but I think that's mostly with what people put on the pasta. Pasta has no saturated fat. I wanted to talk about the omega-3. So the omega-3s, the essential fatty acids, they're called essential because we don't make them, so we have to consume them. This is another, when people are following more of a vegan diet or plant-based diet, a lot of times we'll have them supplement with omega-3s. So there are plant-based sources of omega-3s, mostly in things like flax seeds, walnuts, chia seeds, hemp seeds. The problem is those are not converted well to the active form, to the long chain omega-3. So the most effective omega-3s in our bodies are the kinds that we get from fish, the EPA and DHA. So if you see here, this ALA is what we get from plant-based foods, and it is converted in our body to EPA and DHA, but not very efficiently. So for people that are following a vegan diet, I oftentimes have them take a supplement that's usually made of like seaweed or algae. It's called algal oil. But I'm not opposed to people eating like high quality seafood, like a couple servings a week either. And you have to be careful when you're eating seafood, though. So there are a lot of toxic seafood out there. There's a lot of industrial waste still. What happens is this goes into the ground for, they're called persistent organic pollutants, meaning they stay around forever. They get into the ground, they get into the water. The little bottom feeders ingest things like dioxins, microplastics, PCBs. These are all things from industrial runoff or plastic that we throw away that gets in the water supply. The little fish eat these, and then you get your salmon or tuna. And the bigger fish that have a lot of fat actually store more of these toxins. Mercury is another big one. And they've actually done studies looking at people that just are eating fish regularly, or they maybe go on vacation and eat a lot of fish, and the mercury levels shoot up, and it takes a while to get those out of your system. So it's a real phenomenon. So I really recommend trying to eat smaller fish like sardines, anchovies. If you're doing salmon, not I've had patients that have eaten salmon every day because it's healthy. So you really want to watch the portion sizes that you're eating of that. And salmon also contains saturated fat. I mean, salmon's over 50% fat, and about a quarter of that is saturated fat. So again, when we're eating, we have to try to include that in moderation or eat it with, other sources of seafood. The omega-3s, do have some benefit for heart health. I think the biggest benefit from a health standpoint comes from brain health. So there are some plant-based authors that really, they advocate against eating any fats. Most other people don't agree with that because there have been studies which have shown some cognitive decline, particularly if your omega-3 levels are low. So these are some of the big health benefits: heart health, brain health, which I think is most important. And there's also been studies which show that omega-3 consumption reduces things like anxiety and depression. This was another statement by the American Heart Association. So there's been a lot of controversy over the years as to whether, and I have patients ask me all the time, whether or not they should take fish oil and if it's beneficial. So for the most part, there have been some studies where just kind of observational, watching people that take fish oil, or if they do surveys, they see people that have taken fish oil and maybe they have some benefit in terms of fewer cardiovascular events. Most of the randomized trials where they'll take one group and add fish oil, the other group, they leave them off fish oil, haven't yielded the same results. There was one big trial published a couple years ago where they used just EPA. So you remember there's two kinds of fish oil, DHA and EPA, or two kinds of omega-3s. This is a purified form just of EPA, and that did lead to improved cardiovascular outcomes in people that had already had like a heart attack, stent, diabetes. That's one of them, and there's actually 2 or 3 trials which show that same phenomenon, but that's not something you get over the counter. Any of the fish oils that you usually buy are going to be combinations of the EHA and DPA. And you also have to be careful. There's some concern that some of these fish oils, we don't know where they've been. They've been sitting in hot trucks. They've been sitting on the shelf for a long time. They can become oxidized, and then this becomes a pro-oxidant and can actually be more damaging than it is helpful. There was a meta-analysis, which means a big study that combined a lot of smaller studies that was done by the Heart Association, and they did find a slight benefit in terms of reducing heart attacks, cardiac death, or total cardiovascular disease. What I tell people is, in general, I find that taking the supplements is neutral to slightly beneficial. I think and I think part of that might be because of this oxidation effect. There's all different qualities of fish oil out there. The prescription kinds and more purified forms of fish oils do show some benefit. I would try, if you're consuming some fish, to try to just get your omega-3s naturally or from the algal oil. Yeah, algal oil. So it's basically just oil from algae. I mean, that's where fish get their omega-3s from. So I mentioned this already in terms of omega-3. So again, we don't make these, so we have to consume them. There have been a number of studies here just confirming the importance of these for brain health. So there's one from UCSF in California, this Framingham heart study. These were 2 larger studies that looked at the levels of omega-3s in the bloodstream and cognitive decline. They both showed a very clear correlation between omega-3 consumption, omega-3 levels, and cognitive function. And I already mentioned the thing about the plant-based sources and marine-based sources. So omega-6s, this is another kind of polyunsaturated fat. These are ones that we underconsume the omega-3s, but we tend to overconsume omega-6s. And the reason for that is they're very prevalent in processed foods. So a lot of processed foods use soybean oil. That's the greatest source of the omega-6s. So we need to have some omega-6. It's still an essential fatty acid, but it's one that plays a greater role in inflammation. So if you follow this chart down, we can see omega-6 eventually gets converted to arachidonic acid, and that's really responsible for all the inflammatory responses in our body. So when we take ibuprofen, we take steroids, it actually blocks this conversion, so you don't make arachidonic acid, you don't have as much inflammation. Some of the, and I'm going to show you, well, I'll show you another slide on that, just in terms of the rate, because what's really important is the ratio, but these are all sources that we consume. This was a chart I was mentioning before with the different oils. So if you look at something like olive oil here, most of olive oil is a monounsaturated fat, but there's some polyunsaturated fat, very little saturated fat, but it is present here. If you look at something like coconut oil, it's almost all saturated fat, much lower in polyunsaturated fats. But even the healthier oils, like, or what we talk about, like flaxseed oil, that even has some saturated fat. So that goes back to the nuts, or the, why that aggregately can lead to more saturated fat. But the greatest source of some of these omega-6s, let's see, here it is, linoleic, it's the blue. So all these blue things, so soybean oil is because it's very cheap and used in a lot of processed foods, is one of the greatest sources here. Corn oil, sunflower oil, or safflower oil, sunflower oil, both of those are here. So these are things that contribute most of the omega-6s to our diet. And this was, I thought, something interesting. So I measured the omega-6 levels in the bloodstreams in different countries and found that there was a clear correlation with higher levels and coronary heart disease mortality. So the biggest thing that we have to think about is, again, not going home and saying, well, what exactly has omega-6? What has omega-3? It's just trying to think about, if you're eating more healthy foods, you're going to have a better ratio. So in our country now, our ratio is generally we eat about 16 to 20 times as many omega-6s as we eat omega-3s. That goes along with us eating more processed foods, more soybean oil, and less of the natural foods. So what we really want to try to do is eat less processed foods. That's going to bring that ratio more in line with where it should be. I thought this was interesting, just looking at nuts and seeds. So walnuts, macadamia nuts, pumpkin seeds, these tend to be better in terms of the ratio. You can see the ratio, like for some of these, like 4 to 1, 21 to 1. If you look at almonds, though, it's like 2,000 to 1. It's pretty impressive. They have a lot of omega-6s. But what you also have to keep in mind is all the fats, a lot of the fats in almonds are monounsaturated fats. This is referring just to the polyunsaturated fat content. So when you're thinking about nuts and seeds, like raw walnuts are probably a better choice, or pumpkin seeds are a better choice, or even cashews to some degree. So I thought that was something interesting, because we always think of almonds as being healthy, whereas I usually try to direct people more to some of these other nuts and seeds. And then what about olive oil? This question always comes up. So if you talk about when people think about Mediterranean diet, a lot of times their minds gravitate just to olive oil. So it's high in olive oil, and that's why those people are healthy. But really, the Mediterranean diet is much more than that. So it's a plant-based diet, rich in phytonutrients, healthy fats. They do eat some healthier, usually fish, some animal protein. So the olive oil, there are some studies which I'm going to show you, which shows that there are probably some health benefits to olive oil. One of the reasons I'm not a big advocate for it is most of my patients are obese. Most of the people in our country are obese. I mean, it's about 2/3 plus are obese or overweight, and oil is just very calorie dense. And we talked about the processing of food. So to get from an olive to olive oil, it has to be processed. So you strip a lot of the fiber, a lot of the phytonutrients out. And you can see if we're looking at 500 calories of food, so if someone that's trying to lose weight, 500 calories like fruits, vegetables, beans, whole grains versus 500 calories of oil, it's just not very satiating. So, and this is where I think a lot of patients that are trying to lose weight run into problems is you can saute some broccoli and they put, just dump some olive oil. It could be a 1/4 cup of olive oil or a few tablespoons. That's easily adding 300, 400 calories, 50-something grams of fat. So we don't always think, or we put it on our salads. So just to keep in mind, it's not necessarily that it's the worst food to eat, but it is calorie dense. There have been some studies that were done. This guy Vogel did some studies maybe 20 years ago. So a lot of these plant-based advocates go back to this study. They refer back to this, and what he looked at was when we eat certain fats, and we eat a cheeseburger, saturated fats, we can measure how that affects the flow in our blood vessels. And we find that a lot of these unhealthy foods, these processed foods, cause the vessels to constrict, or at least not dilate normally in response to stress. So he found this with olive oil as well. And so that's kind of where a lot of these guys refer back, and they said, well, it has this vasoconstricting effect. When I looked more at the study and it was dissected more, some of it was also what they ate the olive oil with. So they gave it with different things, like they gave it with bread or they gave it with vegetables. If you give it with vegetables, it has a lot less of an effect in constricting the vessels. So there are some flaws in that study, but if you were to do some reading, some of the authors I mentioned before, some of them are going to refer back to this study. When you look at trials that have been done, there's certainly more evidence that olive oil is beneficial. And part of it, again, is not just that these people are just having olive oil. Part of it is they're eating olive oil calories instead of saturated fat calories or soybean oil calories. So it's that exchange from saturated or trans fats or refined carbs to a healthier fat. So these are just different studies on here. Here's one from I refer to this a lot in my other talk, the Nurses Health Study, Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. They found a significant reduction in heart attacks and strokes in people that ate a greater amount of olive oil. And it was just about one half tablespoon a day. It wasn't that much. Also lower rates of inflammation, improvement in the lipid profile. European study, there was a large European study which showed very similar findings. And this is one I thought was interesting, this one called CardioPrev, which there is an ongoing study in Spain right now. They were actually looking at the effects, not just the cardiovascular outcomes, but the effects of olive oil on the blood vessel's ability to dilate, and which is exactly what this Vogel guy said, was bad. We got vasoconstriction, poor vascular reactivity. In this study, they actually looked at the ability of the blood vessels to dilate, and the people that had more olive oil. So they looked at a Mediterranean diet, which was higher in these healthier fats versus just a low-fat diet. People that ate the Mediterranean diet had much better dilatation of their blood vessels. So it was a 4% increase versus a 1% increase. So, they found that the olive oil probably does have some favorable effects. And they looked at all these other aspects of the blood vessels. They talked about the endothelium. So the ability of these endothelial cells, that inner lining of the blood vessels, to thrive. They did better with more olive oil. There was less reactive oxygen species. So free radicals that we talked about, fewer of those were found to be damaging the inner lining. So they found a number of parameters that were responsible for helping the blood flow to improve in the blood vessels. Cholesterol is another big question we get all the time. So we know that blood cholesterol levels in your blood are not good. They tend to be strongly correlated with cardiovascular disease. But what about dietary cholesterol? And one of the issues with this, it's always been very hard to separate out because most foods that are high in dietary cholesterol are high in saturated fat. And we know that saturated fat is not great. So there's a couple foods, shrimp and eggs in particular, that are high in cholesterol, but not high in saturated fat. So there have been some studies done, which I'm gonna show you. But the previous guidelines in 2010, this was the older version, basically said don't eat more than 300 milligrams of cholesterol. And then the updated version in 2015 just said, well, eat as little as possible, but we're not going to give you a limit because there's not great evidence to suggest that dietary cholesterol has a major effect on cardiovascular health. So this, there was a study done, well, there were two studies. I'll review both of them. I put this one on here regarding eggs because the eggs are one of those foods that are high in cholesterol but not saturated fat. So if we're just looking at eggs, we're not trying to separate out the cholesterol component. A general one egg contains about 200 to 300 milligrams of sodium. One thing that I found consistently in the literature is, there hasn't always been a strong correlation of egg consumption in cardiovascular disease, but there does seem to be a very strong correlation with egg consumption in development of diabetes. This is one large study here, the Nurses Health Study. They showed that eating 5 eggs a week significantly increases the risk of diabetes. And in diabetics that consume eggs, there's a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So diabetics eating greater than 1 egg a day compared to less than 1 egg a week double the risk of cardiovascular disease. And then this was a really big study done. It was almost 30,000 people. So this was a big publication maybe 2 or 3 years ago where they looked at egg consumption, cholesterol consumption. They really tried to separate those factors out from saturated fat consumption. So it was about 30,000 people. It was a review of 6 larger studies done, followed for almost 20 years. Basically, they found that for every 300 milligrams of cholesterol consumed, so again, this may be a large egg or an egg and a half, increased risk of cardiovascular disease by almost, and mortality and death by almost 20%. And when they just tried to say, well, what about just eggs, 1/2 egg a day, which nobody eats 1/2 egg a day, increased the cardiovascular disease 6%, mortality 8%. So if you know, I have patients that eat 2 eggs a day, so you multiply that number by 4. So there does seem to be, this is the largest study that I've come across that's been published. People ask me about egg whites a lot, and there are some issues with egg whites. This promotes release of something called insulin-like growth factor 1, which is a very cancer-promoting hormone. So I talk a lot about that in one of my other talks in more depth. So yeah, well, that's one of the, so there's a couple of things. One is when we cook egg whites, depending on how you cook them. So if you hard boil them, it's better than if you fry them. If you fry them, it releases a lot of these, what they call advanced glycation end products. So that happens when we cook any kind of animal protein. That has a strong association with cancer and heart disease. And then, yeah, just the egg whites, I have a strong association with this insulin-like growth factor 1, which is associated with breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer. So there's good data on that. So even though it's not something that's high in saturated fat or high in cholesterol, it does promote that. So maybe you'll start eating fewer of them. That's part, I go into that more in one of the other talks, but there's actually quite a bit of data on that. As far as prostate cancer goes, so when I was looking at data, Dr. Ornish has done a lot of research on nutrition and prostate cancer, or lifestyle and prostate cancer. So he came up with the 2 foods that have the strongest correlation with prostate cancer are eggs and chicken. And then here are some studies. So there was a study out of Harvard in 2010. You have in patients that had prostate cancer, 2 times the risk of progression in those eating less than 1 egg a day versus rarely eating eggs. Those who consumed 2.5 a week had an 81% increase in dying from prostate cancer. And some of the mechanisms here, there's something called choline in eggs, and there's something called carnitine in red meat. And what happens when we ingest those, the microbacteria in our gut microbiome, converts this to a very toxic substance called TMAO, which promotes cancer, which promotes heart disease. You can actually get those levels measured now. There's a blood test that came out of the Cleveland Clinic. So if you went to your doctor and said, I want my TMAO level checked, that can be done. And then other things that I mentioned, IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, advanced glycation end products. Yeah, I mean, eggs, yeah, exactly. So it's there. I think here they were probably trying, in the studies, they were doing these, there were some randomized trials, and then there's some that are these food surveys. And so my guess is for the food surveys, they were actually probably focusing more on how many actual eggs they ate. But you have to think, if you're eating something that contains eggs, that's adding to the problem. But again, some of it's how they're cooked too, like cooking them like this. I looked at, they're probably cooking them in butter, which doesn't help. But anything that we're cooking at a high temperature for a long time, dry heat, tends to release more of these advanced glycation end products, which have a very strong, so that means grilling meats, roasting meats. So if you're like, that's where like a hard-boiled egg is less bad than a fried egg, just for that reason. You have less of these advanced glycation end products. And then there's other studies which show strong correlation of eggs with colon cancer, as well as mortality. So greater than 5 eggs or 5 times a week increased colon cancer risk by 42%. And then that was based on this meta-analysis of 44 different studies, almost 500,000 patients, and then even mortality in these other large population studies. So, and then the last part I'm going to talk about, just are we doing okay on time? Right there. This will be a quick few slides. I'll try to whip through them. So just because we talked about healthy fats and unhealthy fats, same thing with carbohydrates. So we're trying to focus more on the high fiber carbohydrates, less refined sugars, less refined grains. I'll go through some of these kind of quickly. So I wanted to point out this study too. This one came out about 2 or 3 years ago. Very large study. There was actually 2 of them, one on about 15,000 people, one on 25,000 people. And what they were looking at was, these were based on food surveys. They found that people, if you look here, people that ate the lowest or the highest amount of carbohydrates had worse outcomes than those that ate the medium amount. So usually 50 to 60% of the carbohydrates. People that ate too little were probably not getting enough fiber. The people that ate too much were probably getting too much of the bad carbs. And this other one was 25,000 people. They followed them out for also 20 years or so. You can see that people that ate the lowest carbs compared to the highest had a higher rate of all-cause death, coronary disease, cancer, and strokes. So I like to share this with everyone that's doing like these kind of low-carb diets, or that mentioned they're trying to focus on eliminating carbohydrates. The important thing so basically on healthy carbs are more these refined carbs, so they remove the outer layer of the whole grain, the bran and the germ, which has all the nutrients, and you end up just with this starch. So when we talk about whole grains, we want the whole thing because that includes all the vitamins and the minerals, antioxidants. When you're looking at food labels, if you're buying things like breads or other packaged goods, there's really three things to look at. Looking at the carbohydrate to fiber ratio should be less than 10 to 1. So if you look at like this Dave's bread, total carbohydrates on there are 22 grams, but fiber is 5 grams. So that ratio is about 4 to 1. It has this whole grain sticker on it. And it also has whole grain as the first ingredient. So those are some things if you're buying packaged foods, make sure the first ingredient's whole grain, make sure there's a lot of fiber. And just to point out the protein, for every slice of this is 6 grams of protein. We were talking about people getting enough protein. So if you eat 2 slices of bread, it's 12 grams of protein. Pretty universally, the studies have shown the more whole grains that we consume, less cardiovascular disease. So these are 2 different studies. This was another meta-analysis of a bunch of smaller studies. They showed that those that eat 2.5 servings daily, usually I recommend trying to get about 3 servings, which is maybe a half cup of grains or a slice of bread, versus less than 2 a week, had a significantly lower risk of cardiovascular disease. And then this is another publication with multiple studies which showed that anywhere from 20 to 30% fewer cardiovascular events in those that ate the highest quartile versus the lowest quartile of whole grains. I'll kind of go through these because it's kind of reiterating the same thing. And I wanted to just talk about, I'll point out this one. So people that are trying to eat low carbs also tend to include a lot of artificial sweeteners. So one of the issues with this, particularly with aspartame or Equal and Splenda or sucralose, they have done studies on both of those. They don't get absorbed in our small bowel. They make their way all the way down to the large bowel, and they can have a negative effect on our gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome is really responsible for maintaining our health. They produce something called short-chain fatty acids, and when they're not healthy, they stop producing these. And short-chain fatty acids are very important in our insulin and glucose regulation. So counterintuitively, a lot of these artificial sweeteners, which diabetics consume a lot of, actually can make their diabetes worse. And in fact, here they did a study where they gave people Splenda, and they found that with their next meal that they ate, they required much more insulin and had a greater sugar spike. We talked a little bit about fiber already, about the daily requirements, our underconsumption. The best sources, beans, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. So all those things that are in the base of the pyramid of the plant-based diet. And I won't spend too much time because I know we're getting towards the end here. So I think we've touched on a lot of these things. So, and I'm happy to sit here and answer questions. This is the Vibrant Beat. There's some contact information. So for people that are interested in doing, we do have individual nutrition counseling or lifestyle counseling. For people that are interested, we have cooking classes. We have lectures. We have you guys have great fitness facilities here, but we do individual or group fitness classes. But if anyone is interested in doing a class to learn more about plant-based cooking, we've had families in there, we've had groups in there. So if you ever wanted to make a group from the sanctuary and do that one weekend, it's a fun thing to do. Because a lot of people, like I said, don't really know where to start, or they want to find some familiar dishes that they can prepare in a healthy manner. And that's really what we like to do there. So we have a full kitchen inside. So that's it. So that's I think a good base of information. So when you leave here, you can start your plant-based journey. So what questions?
Yeah, I have a question. A lot of us probably use blenders,
right?
In the morning or sometimes. So I've heard people say that frozen vegetables,
Yeah, I would agree with that because they're usually frozen really in a manner which preserves the nutrition, and really when they're at their peak ripeness. Some argue that they're even healthier because they haven't, you know, when picked when they were green and traveled thousands of miles, like they were picked and frozen right away. The one issue that I have heard, and I've read different viewpoints on this. So with people relying on the smoothies alone, you know, you chop up a lot of the fiber, and you may get a higher glucose spike and higher insulin response to that. So I tell people if that's going to be the only way they're going to get their fruits and vegetables, and you know they're short on time, they don't like the taste, so that's how they're going to get them. That's a great way to get them. Ideally, again, we talk about the less processed, the more processed. So that's still a way of kind of processing them. If you talk to Dr. Esselstyn, who again, one of the leaders in this field, he absolutely hates when his patients eat smoothies. Others recommend eating them. So anyway, I'm not opposed to them. I think they can be included as part of a healthy diet as long as you're eating some of their whole foods. But in terms of just getting the frozen fruits and vegetables, they're fine. Yes.
What do you eat for breakfast?
Yeah, I do have coffee. I do some coffee with oat milk. So I have some staples that I eat. One of the things I make is these different kinds of breakfast bars, which are basically combinations of oats and nuts, maybe dates, maybe some sort of nut butter on top, because I can make them in bulk and I freeze them. I'll take them to work. I usually try to fast till about 9 a.m. But they're easy to take to work. And then sometimes I'll do, like this morning, I had overnight oats. So I blended up berries and dragon fruit and bananas and peanut butter. So it was like a peanut butter and jelly variation. I mixed them with the whole oats and just let them sit overnight. That's an easy breakfast. Sometimes I'll do like a plant-based yogurt with a granola. I'll oftentimes make my own yogurt at home with like soy milk, and maybe even make granola at home. But whatever I do it in bulk. So that's the key when you're eating plant. A lot of people get intimidated. It takes so much time, but I do a lot of stuff. Like I made a lentil stew, and it was great. It had lentils, spinach, sweet potatoes, garlic, onions, you know, really packed with nutrients, cauliflower in it. And I made a big batch of that, and I took it a couple of days this week, and then I froze some of it. So we can have it, you know, next week or 2 weeks. So that's one of the keys with plant-based eating, is just as long as you're putting in the time effort, make it in bulk. But that's my typical breakfast is something like one of those things. So I don't get bored. I'll just kind of alternate. If I were traveling or I was really short on time, I might get, you can buy like the Ezekiel English muffins or Ezekiel bread toast, and maybe make an avocado toast, or just put some almond butter, maybe not almond butter now, almond butter and you know, some jam on it or something. So something, it doesn't have to be complicated. Anything else? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think looking at the one slide I had there with the nutrient contents, I mean, depending on the vegetable oil, like we look at like sunflower or safflower oil, those definitely are much higher in the omega-6s. So olive oil would be superior. When we look at the studies that have been done on health benefits of oils, olive oil, I think, has the majority. I mean, other things like flax oil or canola was in there. Yeah, I mean, not necessarily in terms of health benefit, though. I think they were looking at the omega-3, omega-6 contents. But yeah, the olive oil, and then other things like flax oil is healthier, but you really can't cook with it if you're going to use it to drizzle on a salad. There you can get walnut oil now. But you just have to look. Some of them have they have different smoke points, so some of them you don't want to necessarily cook with. But in general, I'd say olive oil over other vegetable oils. So yeah, so thank you guys all for coming, and I hope you learned something tonight, and hopefully you're going to have a nice, healthy dinner. All right.